Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A Remington R1 Enhanced Threaded Barrel 1911 chambered in 45 ACP. This is our latest addition in the Friendly Fire series, the series where I review guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my purchase bias and then also answer the question at the end as to whether or not I would buy it and what changes I would make. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a little bit of history. Now, we've previously discussed a couple of different aspects of Remington's history, being one of the oldest names in firearms and the oldest name in firearms in America. So I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time going through the nitty-gritty of the history of the company as much as talk about the company's history with the 1911. Now, during World War I, Remington would produce 1911s for the United States military in order to assist Colt in providing weapons for soldiers going overseas. Now, one of the things that's always struck me as very odd about America's involvement in World War I is that the world had been plunged into a globe-spanning conflict starting in 1914, and 3 years later, America decided to hop into it with a woeful lack of arms. Even though the industrial side of the United States had already been producing weapons for many of the players already involved in the conflict. Somehow we didn't have enough arms in order to actually be able to go into open war. This caused a lot of firearms manufacturers to also start producing weapons for the United States military who had not previously been contracted and were not contracted until entry into the war was announced. Now, in the interwar period, Remington would continue to produce some handgun models for its own product line. However, they would kind of fizzle out. And I'm sure some Remington 1911s would still show up in World War II, but the company was not producing 1911s at the time. They were instead producing Springfield Model 1903 rifles, which have been previously covered on this channel through the link to that video in the description. Now, after World War II, Remington would pretty much move over entirely into sporting type sales and would drop their handgun line up until the 2000s when they would come out with the R1. Now, the R1 was a GI spec 1911, very bare bones, very slim trim and all that type of stuff, and actually came out at a time where a lot of manufacturers were offering newer GI-styled 1911s. Now, I actually remember around this time reading an article that was comparing like all of the GI-style 1911s that were out on the market at the time. So it would have been products from Springfield Armory, Taurus, Para-Ordnance, which kind of tells you about the age range of the article right there, as well as Remington. Now, I never particularly cared for the Remington R1 because the rear sights were of the wrong height. The sights in general were of the wrong height. Original mil-spec 1911s had these little tiny nubs of sights, which of course are terrible sights. I'm not saying that they're good by any means, but if you're telling me that something is mil-spec, it should be mil-spec. I'm not looking for something that's improved mil-spec. I would get an improved handgun at that point instead of trying to go after an outdated mil-spec design. So that was my complaint with those. Now, eventually, Remington would diversify that product line a little bit and would come out with a more modernized 1911, something that was a little bit more practical as far as its feature sets and all that stuff was concerned. So they would come out with the Enhanced, which would actually incorporate a fiber optic front sight. Now, longtime viewers of the channel know that I am not a fan of fiber optic front sights, but there were other features about the handgun that were included that I do like. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little sickness right now. Now, after the Enhanced would come the Enhanced Threaded Barrel, which this was intended to take advantage of the suppressor market that had become really big at the time. Now, guys, keep in mind that when it comes to the rampant popularity of suppressors, this is something that's happened within the last decade. Same with really in a lot of ways, tactical rifles to begin with, or tactical weapon systems to begin with. The suppressor market has always existed, and it's been a long-term thing. They've been regulated since 1934, so it's not like suppressors are a new concept, but the accessibility and product diversification of suppressors are relatively frequent, as well as ready-to-go suppressor-ready platforms, which is what the R1 Enhanced Threaded Barrel more or less is. Now, of course, Remington would be acquired by the Freedom Group and would have a lot of issue with quality control and all those types of things, and eventually would declare bankruptcy in 2020. All right, guys, that's history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun? Right off the bat, we have a 5.5-inch stainless steel match grade barrel. Pretty standard barrel, honestly. Of course, we have threads. These are 0.578 by 28 millimeter threads, and they are protected by this thread protector here. This handgun, all the guns in the Friendly Fire series are reviewed as it is that they are supplied to me. This handgun was shot with the thread protector on the entire time because I don't have a suppressor. This gun's actually never been fired suppressed, so I wanted to make sure that I did everything I could to protect the threads should the owner in the future decide that he want to put something on this. Now, of course, you don't have to put just suppressors on here. You could also put like muzzle brakes or something along that line. Our sights are suppressor height sights, which is actually pretty cool because not every suppressor-ready handgun on the market comes with suppressor height sights. It's actually quite frequent that they come with this, whatever the standard sights would be for that particular handgun. I always consider this to be a really big miss whenever you tell me something has a threaded barrel. Now, of course, just because this has a threaded barrel doesn't mean you have to put a suppressor on it. You could, like we mentioned before, put a compensator or something like that on it, and that at that point would not necessitate the use of suppressor height sights. However, if you give me a threaded barrel, my automatic assumption is that you're considering this to be a suppressor host. And if you don't supply suppressor height sights with a suppressor host, that's putting that cost on the user, which impacts my interest in that item at that point if I was looking for a suppressor-ready gun. Now, of course, this could not be necessarily a nefarious act on the part of the manufacturers as much as it might just be that people have a lot of different opinions when it comes to iron sights. And you could sit around and put suppressor height sights on a gun, and then they decide that they don't like those particular suppressor height sights. They want a blacked out rear and a fiber optic front, or they want night sights or something along those lines. So frequently you see manufacturers state, well, I wasn't entirely sure what the public wanted, so I just kind of threw something on there and it's more or less a placeholder, and they'll swap out whatever sights it is that they want, which is a method that you can go. I appreciate that this is at least ready for a suppressor out of the box with these suppressor height sights, even if you wanted to change them. All right, now these sights are actually kind of interesting because they are white dot sights. They are not night sights. And they're actually done up in a 2-dot arrangement, which you might be able to see there. So you stack the dots on top of each other, kind of like a figure 8, almost like shotgun beads in that way, which make for a fairly clean and easy to acquire sight picture. I actually kind of like this little bit of simplicity here. Not to say that 3-dot sights are hard to align by any means, but these are pretty easy overall. These sights are serrated in order to be able to break up glare, which I've never really found to be an issue with pistol sights, but they for sure won't be an issue with the serrations, so I guess there's that. Now you'll also note that we have a very spacious shelf on our rear sight, which allows us to be able to, hook this off of a boot heel or a belt or off of a table, whatever it is, if we need to do one-handed manipulations, which I appreciate that as well. All right, now this is a non-full-length guide rod design, which is kind of surprising when you look at a lot of the other features incorporated with this handgun. However, I don't necessarily think that a guide rod is needed. Now, there's quite a bit of discussion that the guide rod makes for a more accurate handgun with the 1911 platform, which I've had difficulty finding anything that actually scientifically corroborates that. Now, I could understand that the guide rod, the full-length guide rod, throws out additional weight to the front of the gun, which might make it return more smoothly back onto target. And the additional contact surface could allow the pistol to track more flat, which would allow you to get back on target faster. Those types of things would help with faster shooting, but not necessarily more accurate shooting. So I think that's kind of where the discussion lies in there. Now you also note that we have forward cocking serrations on this pistol. People get really bent out of shape over forward cocking serrations, citing that it's added cost for no real added benefit. However, I would say that there's no detriment for them being added as well, especially if I am a firearms manufacturer and I'm looking to make sure that my gun is interesting to the widest demographic of people that I possibly can. By putting front cocking serrations on here, I do not in any way inhibit the function of the handgun, so it's not that it became less reliable, and it appeals to people who do utilize front cocking serrations. Because just because the front cocking serrations there doesn't mean you have to use them. So guys who don't like front cocking serrations can just not use them and still utilize the pistol however it is that they want to, and guys who do use front cocking serrations can continue to do so. I use front cocking serrations whenever it is that they're available to me, so I don't necessarily think it's all that big of a deal. Now, we do have a loaded chamber viewing window right here, which is the only real opportunity we have to be able to passively identify whether or not the firearm is loaded. Now, I personally conduct press checks, which is another hot topic discussion among a lot of people because basically press checks make you look douchey. However, having been at a variety of classes and courses and seen a lot of people step up to the line, myself included, be it about to shoot whatever course of fire at a course or about to go through whatever course of fire at a competition, they bring their gun up, they punch out or they get on their sight, whatever it is that they're doing, and then they pull the trigger and they click, no bang, because they were absolutely convinced that they loaded their gun beforehand, but at some point between when they loaded it last and when they got to the line, the gun had become unloaded. Any wide variety of circumstances could arise that caused that to happen. Because of that, I'm a huge fan of making sure that I have some way of being able to verify that the chamber has a round in it. So most of the time I default to press checks. Having some sort of loaded chamber indicator that is both visual and tactile is a method to go about it. It's just most manufacturers don't have that good of a tactile loaded chamber indicator. This does not have any type of tactile loaded chamber indicator. Now, there's also a discussion to be had because, like, well, you can see into the chamber, isn't that like the same thing? But if you're in a low light type situation and don't have or don't want to use a flashlight, it could be difficult to be able to verify whether or not the chamber is loaded. At the end of the day, guys, all that matters is that before this gun comes up on target, that you have at some point and in some way verified that there's a round in the chamber. Because it happens more than you might think. If you spend enough time shooting and going to competitions and all that kind of stuff, you will see it happen, and it'll probably happen to you. All right, now we do have the original design of extractor and ejector, which is internal to the 1911. I am not a big fan of this. A lot of times if you find a failure point in a 1911 design, it's this ejector and extractor. The problem being is that you kind of wind up having to kind of tune those a little bit in order to be able to get the best function out of them. And they're also a very durable part. They will break down. And that's something that if you're starting to have issues with feeding in your 1911, you probably ought to look at swapping that piece out. I actually prefer the external extractors that you find on Smith & Wesson and SIG 1911s, even though a lot of people consider those to be an affront to John Moses Browning. You also note that we have a lowered and flared ejection port, which is important for reliable clearing of the firearm. I have a GI style 1911 A1 that does not have a lowered and flared ejection port, and sometimes it's a little difficult to get a live round out of the chamber. Kind of gets, if you don't do it super sharp and fast, it kind of gets a little caught up in there. So that is an advantage here. Now you'll notice that our hammer is skeletonized. This is actually a Series 80 safety mechanism. Now, what is the Series 80 safety mechanism and how is it different than the Series 70? Well, the Series 80 has a plunger type firing pin safety, which is important from the firearm being drop safe. Now, keep in mind, guys, that yes, this firearm does have a grip safety, but the grip safety arrests the motion of the trigger. It does absolutely nothing for the firing pin. On a Series 70, they are not necessarily drop safe. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, what's the complaint with a Series 80? What's the disadvantage? And what most people will tell you is that a Series 80 does not have as good of a trigger pull as the Series 70. So why don't we go ahead and talk about trigger real quick here. So we have a very short take up, tiny amount of take up, and we are right on the wall. And then it breaks, and our reset is right back out to the wall. This is an excellent trigger. I would guess it to be about 5 pounds overall. And with that short reset and that minimal amount of take up, I don't consider the Series 80 safety system to be a detriment to this handgun at all. Could it be more crisp or maybe a little bit lighter trigger pull in a Series 70, sure. But I don't think the average person is going to have an issue with this trigger. Now, you also note that our trigger has an adjustable over travel stop, is skeletonized, and also of a half moon shape. All right, I want to go ahead and talk about controls real quick. Now, we will note that we have, of course, a slide release located on the side of the handgun here. Now, a lot of people like to get in debates on this. Is it a slide release or is it a slide stop? In my opinion, this should be able to perform either function, and the shooter chooses how it is that they're going to interact with the pistol from there. So for me, I overhand rack pretty much everything. And that is because it works with everything, not some outdated idea that the only movements that matter in combat or gross motor movements and all that kind of stuff. No, I train with a bunch of different handguns that have their slide releases in a bunch of different places, and instead of trying to train around where each individual slide releases and stuff like that, I just overhand rack the slide and get back into what it is that I'm doing. It is a minor refinement that I have made in my manual of arms to be able to work across a bunch of different platforms that I train on, because I enjoy training different platforms. Now, this slide release is set very far forward, so much so that you have to break your grip in order to be able to reach it if you've got normal sized hands like I do. Now, the important thing to frame in this conversation right now is that the slide release is the most efficient manner to conduct a reload. I'm freely admitting that that is the more efficient and faster method to conduct a reload as opposed to overhand racking. However, if you have to break your grip in order to be able to activate that slide release, I do not consider that a good practice, because then you have to reestablish your grip. There's a good possibility that you could mess up your shooting and all that kind of stuff, not have proper grip on the gun, bad recoil management, whatever it is that it may be. The actual minutia of firing could be impacted by having to readjust your grip back and forth. So whatever time it is that you're saving by utilizing your slide release, you're losing by having to rebuild your grip. So in my opinion, when we're talking about keeping the gun in the fight, the most critical aspects of that should be performed with your firing hand. So that being magazine release, operating a safety, and releasing the slide if that's the method that you use to reload. However, there's another method that can be utilized if you're a big fan of using the slide release, and that is using your support hand to release the slide. On this handgun, I would recommend that if you're wanting to do slide release mag changes effectively. Now, I'm not a big fan of this method because I've already got the neural pathway built that once I come off the reload, rack the slide, my hand immediately goes into creating that thumbs forward grip and all that kind of stuff. When you mess around with utilizing, like, this has been a weird neural pathway for me to try to put together in my head to kind of roll up onto the slide release after inserting my fresh magazine. And because of that, I stopped trying to work around it. Now, if I spend enough time working on it, I could get this down pretty fast. I 100% believe that. But the small amount of time that I was spending just playing with it in order to be able to demonstrate it for videos was kind of messing up my training. Because whenever I would switch back to doing it how I would normally do it, I'd have a temporary stutter step of what method am I using right now. So I stopped even beginning to somewhat play around with it out on the range. That is my recommendation if you want to utilize a slide release on this handgun though. So that was a really long roundabout way to get to use your support hand to release the slide on this. All right, now our safety is an extended safety. It is single-sided and makes an excellent ledge for your firing hand thumb whenever you're building your thumbs forward grip. We, of course, like I mentioned before, have the grip safety, which is an extended beaver tail variety with a memory bump. Our magazine release is extended, and we actually have a little cutout in the grip in order to be able to effectively reach it. I do have to move my grip slightly to be able to reach this magazine release, but it's a very minor motion as opposed to the very major motion it is to get onto the slide release. Now, grip texturing and all that kind of stuff. We have these laminate grip panels, which initially I thought were G10. I actually had to get really close up on them to be able to see the grain in them to understand that they were laminate. Like, I kept seeing in product descriptions when I was doing research for this gun that these were laminate grips, and a lot of the other handguns in those product descriptions actually looked like they had laminate grips, but these are actually laminate. The grips are heavily checkered, which I appreciate. Our front strap is serrated, And our back strap is 20 lines per inch checkered, which I appreciate as well. And it goes all the way up onto the memory bump. I do wish the front strap was checkered instead of serrated. However, overall, there's a lot of grip on this handgun. Now, it's not the grippiest 1911 I ever handled. I remember I believe it was the SIG Scorpion was one of the more aggressively textured 1911s I've ever put my hands on. But this still does a fairly decent job. You'll note that we have a flat mainspring housing, different than the 1911 A1, but this is actually generally the more popular mainspring housing, though I like the feel of the A1. Now, magazines. This came with 2 Remington branded 8-round magazines. I have tried this out with a variety of other magazines from Kimber, as well as like a no-name magazine, Pro Mag, all that kind of stuff, and have found that for the most part, I mean, they fit and all that kind of stuff, but I've run into a couple of issues with drop free on some of the non-Remington branded magazines. Now, these have a bumper plate, which I appreciate. We'll talk about that more here in a bit. One of my issues with 1911 magwells, however, is first off, the grip is very flat and kind of squared off. The magazine is very flat and kind of squared off, and the grip is rather narrow. So sometimes mag changes can be a little bit of a pain with the 1911, which is unfortunate because with the diminished capacity of a 1911, 10 rounds tops for most reliable magazines, with capacity being an issue, you've really got to be down on your magazine changes, especially if you're taking this in a competition or if you're potentially utilizing this in a duty type approach where you're facing somebody who's got way more rounds on hand than you do. You need to be on top of keeping this gun gassed up. So I am not the biggest fan of this magwell all on its own. All right, guys. There's one more thing that I want to say about features overall, and that is that when you consider the amount of issues that Remington's had in the past couple of years with quality control and all that kind of stuff, the R1, at least this one, is incredibly well hand fit, or is hand fit might be a little bit overboard, but it's incredibly well fit. There's a little bit of wiggle, but not a lot. Yeah, there's a little bit of rattle to it, but not like a ton of rattle. Not like you might find like some of the more budget-ended Springfield armories or anything along that line. And the engraving and stuff like that is just absolutely beautifully done. And it really stands in sharp contrast with how Remington has been for the past couple of years with like the 870 and stuff like that, where it was very clear that they were putting no real time or effort into what it was that they were manufacturing. This gun, and how the bluing's applied and all that kind of stuff, this gun is incredibly well done. It is a night and day difference between what Remington has been producing and what they were producing. All right, guys, that pretty much covers features. Why don't we go ahead and talk about shooting? All right, so shooting this handgun, it's shot like a 1911. Now, one of the things that I've kind of noticed about 1911s is that there's a lot of movement whenever shooting a 1911. That's not to say that it's snappy or it's flippy or anything along those lines, as much as to say that there's a lot of reciprocating mass moving above the line of bore and above your hand. So it's not so much that it's uncontrollable recoil or anything like that, as much as recovery takes a little bit longer. And you really start to notice that if you put it on the timer and start doing like multi-shot drills and all that kind of stuff where you're really trying to get shot strings together pretty quickly, 1911s are a little bit slower. Now, I've shot 1911s precisely, I've shot them far, I've shot them fast and all that kind of stuff, and it's something that you kind of have to lean into and really really kind of drive the gun into the target, where I don't feel like I have to do that as aggressively with more modern designs. Just something to kind of take into account there overall. Now, I only had one even slight hiccup with this handgun. I had just one shot string where I had a failure to go into battery, and it was solved by tap. I didn't even have to get to rack. Tap brought it into battery, and I got right back onto target. As far as reliability with magazines and all that kind of stuff, I ran it with a full gambit of magazines. The only real issue I had was the drop-free thing that I mentioned before. Which just meant that, it was actually it was a good training day from that standpoint, because what if your magazine doesn't drop free? It was good to kind of have to assess what it was that I was doing and not just going through the motions. So making sure that I stripped that magazine out of there, I flipped the gun in order to be able to get it out of the way so that I could get the next loaded magazine into it and all that kind of stuff. So that was good from a training standpoint, but it might be something you want to pay attention to if you're purchasing magazines for your 1911 in general and your R1 enhanced threaded barrel specifically. Now, another thing you have to take into account with suppressor height sights, the same as when you mount optics on a pistol, you do run into a height over bore thing, which I don't normally associate with pistols. The vast majority of handguns out on the market with standard height sights, it's pretty much point of aim, point of impact out to 25, honestly. So with this handgun, on some of the closer range stuff, you do wind up having to take height over bore into account, which is not normal for me with pistols. I expect it with rifles. It's one of the things that I'm looking for whenever it is that I'm doing close range drills with rifles, but not so much with pistols. So it kind of kept throwing me off. Now, we're not talking about the difference between, well, I was holding at the, right here up on his forehead and I shot this dude in the chin. It's more like I was holding up here on the forehead and I was getting closer to dotting in between the eyes type of deals. So you would still be in A zone and all that kind of stuff, especially if you held high A zone. But if you were going after like the A zone box, you might be running into a little bit of issue with height over bore for that. Otherwise, target transition and all that kind of stuff, the pistol tracks smoothly, just a little slowly, when we talked about before with cycling and all that kind of stuff. All right, guys. That's shooting. What are my recommendations? Would I recommend this handgun for duty type use? I would not. Purely because of magazine capacity. Right now, if you're talking about a duty use where you might actually have to face an armed assailant or offender, they're probably going to be carrying something that has more capacity than a 1911. And any advantages, perceived advantages you get out of the 1911 platform, the 45 ACP cartridge, whatever, are all paling in comparison to the fact that somebody else could have 15, 17, 19, 21, 30 rounds, whatever it is that they may have. And at the end of the day, that means that you have to carry more of these, and there's only so much space to carry magazines. You're gonna need a lot of them if you're gonna be able to keep up with somebody who does have a high capacity handgun who can keep shooting at you long past the point that you've run out of ammunition. And that was something that I was keenly aware of when whenever I was working on like Mozambiques or El Guapo type shooting iterations, shooting drills and stuff like that. So just something to take into account. Now, would I recommend this for concealed carry use? Absolutely not. This is a heavy handgun. This is a large handgun. It's a slim handgun, which is one of the dimensions that I look for in concealed carry handguns. It's something that's rather slim, but the weight and the size are two things that'll very quickly become detractors to somebody trying to use this as a concealed carry handgun, especially if we're talking about it in the modern sense of concealed carry, which is actually concealed inside of a waistband, trying not to necessarily dress in a manner that identifies you as being somebody who probably has a gun, any of those types of things, as opposed to the 1990s method of wearing like a fishing jacket over top of your outside the waistband holster that has a full-size handgun in it. If you're talking about inside the waistband, or especially appendix inside the waistband, with this being a ½ inch longer than the standard 1911, I would not recommend this handgun for concealed carry. especially since for a lot of people, when it's heavy and it's big and all that kind of stuff, it becomes difficult to carry in all situations, especially if this is not like a winter carry. If you're talking about like summer or something along those lines, it's going to wind up sitting in the car, or it's going to stay at home in the safe. And that's not helpful to concealed carry if you don't have the gun when you need it. It's like one of the basic tenets of concealed carry. Would I recommend this for home defense or something along those lines? Now, that kind of gets into the suppressor type aspect of this. And there's some discussions to be had along that line. Are suppressors applicable in home defense situations? Do you want everybody in the neighborhood to know that you're in trouble, or do you want to maintain your own personal situational awareness and hearing in that self-defense type situation? That is a very individual decision. I see pros and cons either way. My biggest concern is to me in the gunfight. So if a suppressor allows me to be able to keep my wits about me and allows me to be able to communicate with my family or be able to understand if there's additional threats in the area, then a suppressor is a pretty good choice. I mean, I can have somebody else dial 911 and let the police know to come running. Like I don't need the entire neighborhood to know that I'm in a gunfight in order to be able to get the help that I need. But I do need to be able to communicate with the rest of my family so that they know to call the police and I can handle business from there. In addition to that, it's already a heavy handgun. You add a suppressor, this becomes a even larger and heavy handgun. And I mean, great, you'll have a bedside to be able to support that weight, but it might complicate whether or not this fits into your gun safe. And if you're running into a situation where you're like, hold on, bad guy, let me prepare my home defense option for you, that's probably not the best method to employ. In addition to that, I know I'm bringing up a lot of cons for this being a home defense option, but I promise I don't think it's that bad of a home defense option. We'll note that we do not have any place to be able to mount a light. Now, of course, lights in self-defense type situations are kind of a hot button topic. There's a lot of things you have to take into account whenever you discuss that. However, having the ability to be able to identify your target utilizing a weapon-mounted light is not a bad thing, especially as long as you have a non-weapon mounted light available so that you can still identify threats, because not everything needs to have a gun pointed at it in order to be able to discern whether or not it's friend or foe. You know, your 8-year-old kid who got up in the middle of the night, grabbed a glass of water, probably doesn't need to have a loaded gun pointed at him. So if that's the only place you've got a light, that's something you have to take into account. However, we also do not have night sights on this handgun, so I consider that to be a miss as well. Specifically because even if I don't have an active light source, I would still like a passive means to be able to engage in the dark. What about a competition pistol? Actually, this would be a pretty good option for a competition pistol. Go ahead and get a compensator or something like that, thread it on the front of this here, and then run this in a heavy metal division at 3-gun, or, you know, there are some competitions out there that go based off of power factor. So having a 45 ACP puts you in a major power factor. Combine that with a compensator or something along those lines. It gets you into more like unlimited classes and stuff like that. But this could be a potentially competitive option for you, especially if you spend some time on the trigger or something like that. All right, what about as a suppressor host in general? I am not a big fan of the concept of handguns as suppressor hosts. This is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I don't care. The whole point of a handgun to me is to be a small, compact, portable option that is available to me when a rifle is not. When you add a suppressor to that, that completely changes that dynamic. It actually more or less, especially a gun of this size and weight with a suppressor added onto it, that more or less turns this thing into its own dedicated weapon system. And with that, I am stuck with a handgun cartridge. I don't even have a rifle cartridge to be able to be a part of that designated weapon system. It's kind of like the whole concept of the Mark 23. Oh, cool. It's a super big handgun and it's basically a primary weapon, but it's still stuck to a handgun cartridge. That's not really primary weapon to me. That's the complete opposite. In addition to not having a third point of contact and all that kind of stuff, what advantages am I getting out of this handgun at this point? The answer is very few. So I'm not a big fan of handgun suppressor hosts. They hold no interest to me. They pretty much remove a lot of what I consider to be the advantages of a handgun in tactical application. All right, guys, so based off of that, would I buy this? And the answer is no, which is kind of funny because I'm the one who talked the owner of this handgun into buying it. At the time, he was looking for a handgun suppressor host, and I knew that one of these was available for a fairly decent price. Now, when it comes to suppressor handgun hosts, 45 ACP isn't the worst idea in the world, only because the ammunition is already subsonic to begin with whenever you're shooting 230 grain FMJs, which are the most common cartridge available for the 45 ACP. So that is what kind of led me towards sending him in this direction. That's why he bought it, but he's never suppressed it. He's never really messed with it for its original intended purpose, as much as he's kind of kept it around with that being the intent. All right, so if I did buy it, what would I change about it? Well, first off, I would upgrade these sights over to night sights, and then I would probably compensate this handgun, and I would use this as a competition handgun at that point. That's with this extended barrel and not necessarily want to get into suppressors to begin with, that is, in my opinion, the best use for this handgun. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular handgun. I hope you guys found this interesting overall, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.